I would really love to learn a bit more about your past work as well. So, beginning with the North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries, this is a state agency, obviously of the state of North Carolina, in case that wasn't clear, and it manages the marine resources in the coastal waters there. So, how that works with, coastal waters and then what's under the federal jurisdiction and then what's under state jurisdiction for someone not coming from a federal state. Could you explain a little bit how that works? So, what was the focus of this work at the Division of Marine Fisheries, and how does this, the state and state agency interact with a federal policy on fisheries in the U.S.?
U.S. fisheries management does kind of operate upon multiple sort of layers of governance. Does a fairly good job of recognizing that fish don't respect state borders, which is as always helpful. And there's sort of overarching federal NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service management. Then there's 6 regional councils that manage kind of the federal fisheries. So there's a North Atlantic, Mid Atlantic, South Atlantic, Gulf, Northwest, Pacific Northwest, kind of then West Coast, and then I think there's another one for Hawaii as well. That was not my neck of the woods. So kind of bodies that manage at the federal quasi levels, and then down to the state level, each coastal state has its own fishery management authority. Things bleed across agencies and industries, and it very kind of works across things. And there are also clear remits, and so states have control of all marine resources from, I believe, 0 to 2 miles out from the coastline, or 20, sorry. I was the economist for the state. My role was to essentially evaluate and advocate for the value of the state's marine resources as it relates to management decision making. So when management decisions were made, attempt to quantify the economic impact of that to the state, look at various marine resources and understand their relative and economic contributions to the state's management and things like that. All very interesting. But the thing about it that actually kind of disenchanted me and kind of got me looking towards other opportunities in the long run was the very strong focus that North Carolina had on promoting recreational fishing access. The way that the economic modeling tools that we used worked, and I can't argue with the methods behind them, stated that the value of the state's recreational sector was roughly 10 times that of the commercial harvest sector. So, and that's considering things like hotels and restaurants and tourism and gas and all of these sort of compounding elements that support a recreational fishing sector, then looking at commercial in terms of just, the harvest industry and then the supply chains out to, retail and restaurants and things. So what that ended up doing was forcing me as a state employee to frequently have to argue and advocate for recreational fishing access. I like to fish. I think it's fun. I don't think that I deserve first right to resources that have kind of provisioning power to them and things like that. So I just kind of generally disagreed with just because something is worth more on paper, we should be prioritizing that. Understanding kind of that government level, we're not just managing fisheries for the food resource aspect, we're managing this marine resource and all of the potential value that can come out of it. Tourism and access and things like that ends up becoming a really big point at the state level.
So, when you say more valuable, do you mean lucrative in terms of what's paid for the fishing licenses or the contributions to the state economy, tourism versus fishing?
Contribution to the state economy. So it's this kind of complex thing of saying, looking at basically effort across commercial and recreational. So for the commercial side, we had much better statistics on, exactly how much was harvested and landed and permits and things like that. We know how many permits there are for recreational, and then there's statistical methods through sampling and survey design to get a general understanding of how much fishing has been done and how much harvesting has occurred. So using those efforts, you can kind of extrapolate that out based on a lot of assumptions of spending and complementary industries and things like that. So, basically saying that, if the state's marine resources were, at the end of the year were $100 million in ex-vessel landing. The value of the state's recreational fishing sector was roughly $1 billion every year. So that was kind of how the modeling works out and things. And in North Carolina is a tourism-focused state in many ways, and it does base itself on a lot of charter fishing and sport fishing and things like that.
It reminds me of a documentary I once saw about also, it was, I think, islands in the Caribbean, also very much depending on recreational fisheries to attract tourists, etc. But there it was very much overlooked to properly measure the impacts of that on the stocks, etc., because it is just harder to manage.
It's a significant contribution too.
Yeah, interesting. Because it's not something I happen to have seen that documentary in my free time, but not something that I've encountered much in this work that
Yeah.
people are talking about.
No, it's not something that intersects with my current role at all, really. So it's just something I try to keep in my head.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting perspective. So thanks for sharing that. So I often reference that, in the sector, it would be good if we have more understanding and reference to the role of governments, legislation, public policy in fisheries management, which I sometimes feel uncomfortable saying it because I'm like, if someone gonna think I'm just saying this to create work for myself because that's what I'm specialized in. But I just think it's, I talk to a lot of people that work at governments and that work kind of at the Ministry of Fisheries. I've interviewed a few people for this podcast series as well. And I feel like there's just very little interaction maybe with the sector. And ultimately it all has to kind of like work together. So building on your role for a public institute, but you also have that more like supply chain effort experience. What do you think is maybe the biggest strength of, the like policy, the public institutes, and where do you feel like, well, there we should support as a supply chain and we should focus on that still?
The strength and weakness of governments in this space are the same thing in my mind, and that is kind of the stability of government. Um,
And an excellent time to make that point.
yeah, so U.S. fisheries management is based on Magnuson-Stevens Act, which has been around since sometime in the 70s, with very little change since. And so, it's stable, very good rule of law, all these sort of things. I think good governance is great. It provides obviously strong structure, foundation, frameworks to work within, but it's also slow. And that is, I think, the layer that I dealt with a lot at the state is there's not a lot of appetite for change. There's not a ton of people, at least where I was, that I felt like really wanted to upend any kind of ideas or techniques or things like that. And then, if there was decision to change, years, it's a long process. And so I think government is great to provide, rigid frameworks and legal structure and is necessary to understand to know, what are the rules of the game I'm playing in many ways. But, I think in terms of a lot of what I do now in terms of how do we push emerging best practices forward? How do we define these things? How do we engage with supply chains to push this product into end markets more and things like that? I find government to be not necessarily a helpful actor in that regard. I think kind of government is not necessarily great at new ideas, if that makes sense.
It's not where innovation blossoms. No.
No. And, that's not necessarily the role of it. And so I think it has a role to play, but I do think in terms of kind of the role of what GSA does in a lot of these things, it is more of kind of a foundational resource for us versus a day-to-day kind of stakeholder type of thing.
Valid points that I wouldn't disagree with. And it's interesting. I think now maybe especially with technology and then, people are always like, oh, technology, like in the supply chain, we talk about that a lot, right? But then I think if you would work for the government, you're like, I'm still explaining how Google Drive works to like a lot of my colleagues. So let's not go crazy on the impact of
So, I mean, when I
AI.
left in 2021, we were still taking paper trip tickets for landing.
I hear that as well. Like I focus a lot on the possibility to have data exchange and particularly in the context of fisheries management, then sometimes I hear very developed countries, they still have everything on paper. And yeah, that makes things difficult if you still need years to just put everything into databases. So yeah, I think sometimes it's very simple, practical limitations that we have that are very easy for everyone to understand, but we might not know that they exist because not everything is moving at the same pace of innovation.
100%. And so I think like we are as GSA trying to cater to a lot of that data side too and building out better technology. But I think from our end of the camp of, people who are engaging more with the production side, it's do this, but you got to make sure it's done in a way that does not leave behind people who are still doing less digital forms of fishing and farming and all these sorts of things too. So I think that technological pull as well in our area is a really difficult challenge as well because that's always been my, again, unintended consequences is always my concern.
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't want to have that be exclusive. On the one hand, technology can make something very inclusive because everyone has a phone and they could download an app, for instance, but not everyone is necessarily digitally literate, to call it like that. I don't know if that's a word, but it can also just be, yeah, maybe it's inclusive on the technology side, but maybe not so much on the human side. So another question I have, I'd like to understand a little bit more about you and how you are in your work and kind of your beliefs. So could you maybe tell me if you have any personal values or beliefs that shape the way that you approach your work in the sector?
Yeah. You know, I think I kind of got into this before, and I don't mean this to be preachy in any capacity, but like, I think I do like legitimately believe in kind of the untapped potential of seafood as a kind of a development tool, whether it's for, the developing world or for, just climate change as a global challenge or, all of these sorts of issues. I think seafood is an area that's, that wants to innovate, that has the appetite for it, that has so much more potential for growth as well. Especially on the farm side, but I think in the wild capture side, there's so much area for innovation improvement as well there too. And so I think for me, it's kind of that idea that it's still a bit of an unshaped clay and that seafood still has so much room to change and grow and influence how the world kind of adapts into this, this next era of, a much more manufactured existence of, with climate change and all these sort of things. And so, um, I think that excitement about knowing that there's so much opportunity there and so much interest in investing in that opportunity is what keeps me around.
Yeah, so strong passion too. It's not an easy sector to work with, so I feel like
But I
those
like
that stick around.
it's like that's kind of where I got into it too, is like what's the most confusing food system to go work in? And then what can I go do with it?
Be as self-destructive as possible.
Yeah, exactly. There's, we all have a little bit of that, right?
So if I ask someone at GSA, describe David for me, how would you think they would describe you in your work persona?
I definitely am one of the more outspoken seafood professionals at GSA. I know what I think, and I generally am fairly happy to say it if I agree or disagree with things. And ultimately, I do think I care a fair bit about what we're doing with GSA. I would like to think they'd say I'm pretty passionate about this. Hopefully, not too annoying. But beyond that, I think I try my best to, represent GSA as well as I can for kind of what we do because I think that GSA has a really important role to play. So, they'd probably describe me as loud and annoying, but in a good way, maybe.
I mean, I think if you are passionate and opinionated, that's gonna sometimes be a
Dangerous
little bit
recipe there.
annoying. Yeah, exactly. You know what I've actually found? I mean, I've always been opinionated in my personal life or about things, but I think when I started in the seafood sector, it's like, okay, I have to be modest. You don't know that much about it. And then at some point I decided, yeah, okay, I'm done being this like neutral person. I only represent my own organization now. I can say whatever I want. I can only destroy my own organization. And I started, I think, maybe quite cautiously, but then now that I got into being, I guess, more vocal, I found it's a little bit addictive. It's really just an interesting sector, and there's just so many things. And I love how, having more of an opinion on things means that I'm also more second guessing myself before I say
No, I
something
agree.
because I'm actually saying something. So it
Get your
really
neck out there,
forced,
you know?
yeah, it forced me so much to educate myself more. Where I'm constantly like, I put out a newsletter. I can't do that without double checking my sources. Someone might still not agree with me, and that's completely fine. But I wouldn't want them to disagree with me because what I'm saying is basically bullshit. Like, of course, it can be, yeah, you can disagree, but at least whatever I'm saying, it needs to be based on something. It shouldn't just be like random opinions. So yeah, I think I transitioned also to being more opinionated, and maybe annoying. I was always passionate, but it's yeah. I found it, I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm like, whatever, come at me if you want.
I'm still trying to figure out what GSA wants out of me and my role here. They haven't told me to stop, sharing my opinions on it either. So I'm just gonna keep doing
It's a
it.
good sign.
No, and I think it's ultimately this is a business and we work in the sustainability side of things, but this is a for-profit industry global business. And so finding the ways to situate yourself within that in a way that's, you know, disruptive but not overly, I think it's a unique challenge.
Yeah, and it's also just personally, I sometimes don't trust people that don't stand for anything. I'd rather have me knowing that I disagree with you and then work with you than not knowing what you stand for.
Or just not having opinions, which is even worse.
Yeah. So, what is something that really surprised you when you started working in the sector?
It's not maybe not surprised, but kind of rattled me a little bit was like, government is a bit of a kind of an isolation zone of you just kind of are managing and doing your job and going into, GSA, yes, I'm going into a nonprofit, like an NGO environment, but it's also, we do third party certification. We are smack dab in the middle of the business world of what I do. So I think having to kind of reframe things from just like a marine resource perspective to a fact, this is a trade good, this is a business that we are an NGO that's mission driven, but we are primarily dealing with profit and loss based companies and things like that. And so I've always believed there's a business case for sustainability. That I think that proves itself out, but I think getting better at being more vocal about that and talking about the business case for sustainability and how what we do is a positive influence on every part of seafood, not just the environmental footprint and things like that. That was a challenge, but it's fun too. I kind of like the fact that we are so in the thick of it too.
I think a lot of NGOs, or not necessarily NGOs, I mean to say not for profits, they could maybe benefit from thinking a little bit more from that business perspective and thinking about the bottom line of a business, because I don't often see it reflected, where I do think sometimes not-for-profits will be aware of it. It will be aware that, if you need to install certain technology or you need to have an auditor come, or those things, that they cost money and that ultimately the vessel owner is paying for that, and that affects their bottom line. But I think if that would be better acknowledged proactively by not-for-profits, that maybe the sector would feel a little bit more heard. Because I do notice whenever I go to a panel session or something, and there is actually someone representing that perspective of the vessel owner, that's something they're very vocal about. Like, you have to realize that, our margins aren't always that great. All these things cost money. And sure, if we have a critical mass and the adoption of these things will become cheaper, then maybe we could have a conversation. But until that time, it's just an investment for us where it's not really clear how we're going to get a return on that investment.
Yeah, we like to think of certification as a demonstration of your commitment to best practice, but you go talk to a vessel owner and this is a business expense.
Yeah,
This is something I
exactly.
have to pay in order to sell to
Market
someone else. And
access.
so you get ranges and they understand the value behind it from an actual assurance. And But I think at the end of the day, there's often an argument that needs to be made of, we get a lot of push of I'm doing all of these things. Why do I need to go pay to have it demonstrated on a certificate? Can't you just trust that I'm doing all of these things? And that's not our decision to make necessarily, but it does again, it puts us back in that interesting place of kind of defending the economics of this whole supply chain too.
Because I think the business case itself, I fully agree with you that I think, sustainability and the bottom line, they can go hand in hand. Sometimes it's just a matter of communication. And yeah, like you say, just kind of operating in that multi-stakeholder environment, it's a learning curve. It's constantly changing, and people that are technically in the same box of stakeholders, they might not necessarily agree with each other. So it's not necessarily always that easy.
So yeah, a friend of mine in seafood who held a role very similar to what I do now, um, gave me some of the best advice I ever got early on at my time at GSA, which was, you're doing your right as a standards owner if everybody's a little bit pissed at you all the time. So you should be continually pushing producers, harvesters, whoever, to the next level of expectation from, best practice standpoint. But you also, you have the really high-minded NGOs or even retailers of the world who say, we want to be here. I find myself in the middle saying, yeah, we want to get there too, but we can't go there yet because it's going to ruin or challenge or, put stress on this side that is not helpful at this time. So it's constantly managing the push and pull of, not meeting everyone's expectations all the time. So it's part of that management is just knowing comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's an excellent way to put it.
Letting people be pissed at you, whatever it is.
It's someone once told me that people not liking you, you should just consider that the cost of doing business. And that's something that I always
I
just
like
try and keep in mind. So if you ever would leave the seafood sector, which it doesn't look like you're going to do that anytime soon, but let's say, at some point in the future, what do you think would be the reason for you to do that?
my biggest frustration with seafood, but it's also the reason I probably could never leave. My wife works in marketing, so I spend a lot of time thinking about the marketing aspect of everything that happens. As far as I'm concerned, seafood is the only animal protein across the planet that has voluntarily positioned itself with a marketing halo of sustainability, kind of responsibility in general. Every other significant animal protein, when you think about, I guess, your beef, chicken, and porks of the world, they will talk about sustainability and human rights and things in various capacities, but it is not a foundational marketing principle that they base their entire industry on. Seafood, from the smallest aquaculture farmer to the largest wild capture harvester, has baked sustainability or responsibility into their business plan at some core foundational level. And so I love that, but it puts seafood at such a competitive disadvantage to these other industries when you go out there and try to compete on things maybe like price or just capacity and efficiency and all these sort of things. And then from it, I'm sure there are all of the various NGOs out in the world that are attacking beef, chicken, and pork the way that seafood is attacked. But it does feel like there's this expectation of seafood to respond more, and that there's a consumer perception of that seafood constantly needs to be improving and adapting and listening and all of these things. It's not saying how do we remove this marketing halo from our line of work. It's how do you bring beef to the table? How do you bring pork to the table? How do you get these guys to the same level of consumer perception and things like that? And one really random example, talking a lot these days about responsible soy sourcing for aquaculture feed and the role that soy has on land use change and ultimately climate change and things like that. And big demands from buyers about wanting certain types of soy going into their feed versus not. And we've been doing a lot of kind of number crunching about, where is this even going to come from? Does the math add up? And it's tight. But at the end of the day, if the beef industry woke up and said, we want to change, we want to buy this type of soy, it's all going to beef. And so I think we can sit here and do everything we want to improve the environmental and social profile of seafood, and that is all good. But like these other animal protein industries that exist kind of in a vacuum outside of what we do also have a ton of power in the global kind of buying landscape. And I think if the sustainability conversation becomes more of a, table stakes for those types of industries, it would have really, really big implications.
Very interesting what you mentioned. It's like, yeah, we have that discussion a lot in the context of seafood, but there's a lot of other animals that are being fed.
Yeah, yeah,
And what about them? It's, I think also what I find with seafood is that with, a lot of terrestrial animals that are farmed, of course, seafood has certain challenges in the context of fisheries because it's not farmed. It's basically like hunting and it's out at sea. Sure, that has certain challenges, but at the same time, seafood has the potential to actually be a sustainable source of food because it can have a very low, environmental footprint and things like that. And that is something I feel is very often not highlighted. And in that sense,
agreed.
it's, unfair to kind of throw that onto the pile of, oh, it's animals, so it's unsustainable. It's like, well, a lot of meat is unsustainable because it's so inefficient to be feeding an animal so much food, and then you only get a certain amount of edible food back for it. And that's just very inefficient. And seafood's actually, a lot of species would be an exception to that. Some are, of course, terrible if we're talking maybe about ranched bluefin tuna or something like that. But there's a lot of examples of extremely sustainable sources of
And it gets
seafood.
back to like kind of where my passion here is, and I think it's there's transformative potential in all this sort of stuff. Um,
Uh-huh.
and that's where I get frustrated. Is like I feel like there's a level of consumer perception that doesn't even want that transformation to happen, and that it's how do you get everyone to kind of understand what the long term is? And the forest through the trees and stuff. I think that's always a challenge if you're not engaged in an industry and things like that too.
If you'd had to pinpoint one misconception about seafood in the US, so you'd like the biggest misconception, what would it be?
That's very hard simply because it is very, very evident on a global stage these days. The U.S. very diverse culturally and regionally and all these things. And I mean, the U.S. is 50 countries in many ways too. And so there's a lot of seafood culture in certain parts of the country, a lot of places that really have zero seafood culture as well. And so I think there's very different perceptions around seafood depending on where you come from. Obviously, like I'm kind of New England born and bred, and I have my thoughts, and I probably have extremely different thoughts from someone from, Oklahoma who, is just, you know, starting to like the fillets of salmon they can get at their seafood counter or something like that. And so I think understanding the cultural variability in the US as it relates to seafood, especially, is quite interesting. If I had to put one giant circle around something, it would probably come back to aquaculture, and it would probably come back to just general misconceptions around how seafood is actually farmed. And again, kind of comparing it to the other proteins they eat in the world. And I think just believing that fish farming is dirty because they were told it. And, the idea that it's somehow worse for the world to do things in the water than on the land, I think is this weird misconception. And maybe, and this comes back to the kind of the government side of this. So I learned this in grad school, and it, I think, started me on my path. My favorite slash least favorite fact of U.S. fisheries management law is that we still base our regulations for aquaculture siting on the Magna Carta. We basically use like early 1000s English law based on the idea of public water bottoms and that this is all public good, things of that nature. And so basically, we can't farm salmon in the US because of the Magna Carta. And so, I think like there's these layers and deep historical connections to some of these misconceptions, but I think there's been almost a forceful misconception around what fish farming looks like in the US for many, many years.
Yeah, and I think once there is a reputation for an industry, it takes a long time to change it. The one in Europe that people always bring up when they learn that I work in seafood is tilapia and pangasius. They're always like, oh, but I shouldn't eat that, right? I'm like, no, you're fine. Just eat it. I stop talk. Just stop nagging me about this fish. It's fine. Your information is 10 years old, at least.
It's shocking how many people, when I tell them what I do, will still look at me and go, "So you think farmed fish is okay?" I'm like, I better, I'm like, it's
Yeah.
based on what I do here.
If not,
So
I'm in deep trouble.
yeah, so it is. I think there's still a very concerning percentage of the population that is, and I think it's aging out a little bit, but I think there's a population that's been conditioned to believe that a farmed fish is just dirty,
Yeah,
and it's a
that's
challenge,
interesting.
but it takes time.
I also don't quite know where it comes from, and that I think makes it challenging to change as well. Where
Yeah,
if
yeah,
even some of these documentaries are gonna, rack up 10-year-old data, it's like, how are we gonna go against that? Like, it's takes time, like you said.
yeah. There's media sides to this too and stuff that's for a different podcast, guess.
So, wrapping up, I would like to ask you, what do you hope your legacy would be?
Question, Ava.
I know.
I like to think that there's still too much time to tell for me in that question, but
Sure.
I got into this from the kind of that economic lens of things and ultimately thinking about how improving the value of things can improve the sustainability in things and vice versa. It's for me thinking of tools like certification and market access as means to drive broader improvement. And I think in this role, it's been exciting for me to kind of see how we get to engage with producers around the world and we actually get to have these conversations and I get to learn about challenges and issues and I get forced in between these hard places between, the buyer and the seller of what the middle ground should be and all this stuff. I always want to be focused on improving the value of seafood for producers. That's kind of what I want. I don't want to say legacy. That feels like too big of a word for me, but like I want my net result of what I do to be that, the people out in the world catching or farming seafood are getting better livelihoods for it, getting better product off the shelf because of it and things like that. And, the world is made a better place through seafood is kind of how I want to see it. And which sounds lofty, obviously. I think there's a lot of ways that you can think about the idea of making seafood production more valuable and more responsible and things like that. But for now, I think what I'm doing is a good effort.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. It was really great to speak with you. You obviously have a range of experience, and I always appreciate getting your thoughts. And
I was glad to be here, Ava. I was quite flattered to be invited on for your first podcast series here.
yeah, well, I'm sure you're too modest to recognize it yourself, but I'm sure that the audience will have learned a lot from
And
from
I
your
hate the sound of
perspectives.
my own voice, so this is yes, this is for everyone else,
Well,
not for me.
starting a podcast is actually an excellent method to try and get over that.
Let me know how it goes,
Yeah.
So